In this video we'll talk about how you can write custom code to handle synchronization of data. So in the case where a list is based on a SQL data source, Alpha automatically writes all the synchronization code. So you can see how, for example, if I go and edit that city and change it to, say, Frankfurt, and then go ahead there and save the record, and then go here and change Anna, change that name over there and hit the save button. Then when we go ahead now and hit the synchronize button over here and then look at the debugging information, because we've turned debugging information on here, we can see that Alpha automatically generated two SQL statements, one for row 1 and one for row 2. In row 1 it executed an update statement changing the city to Frankfurt from Berlin, and in row 2 it executed an update statement changing the name as shown over here. So in this particular case there was no work that the developer needed to do at all in order to synchronize the data, because Alpha wrote all the synchronization code automatically. But in the case where a list control is based on a custom data source, so you can see, for example, in this case we have a list control over here, and this list is based on a custom data source. There's an XBasic function that is going to get called to retrieve the data. And when you're basing the list data on a custom data source, then you need to write your own event handlers for synchronizing the data. So in this particular case we've chosen a very trivial example where this XBasic function is going to retrieve data from a text file on disk. But in a more realistic example, your XBasic function will be calling a web service to retrieve data. So in this case, this function called xb_getData, which we'll look at next over here. So let's go look at xb_getData. This function is just simply opening a text file on disk and retrieving some JSON data. So you can see over here, here's our text file on disk. This is the JSON data that's going to be displayed in the list. So when we go over here and we display the data, we can see that there's the 3 records that are shown in this text file on disk right now. So if I go here and basically change this record from Jones, say, to King, and then go ahead now and hit save and then hit the synchronize button, the data is synchronized. And if I go back now to my text file over here, I'll see now that the data has been edited, and there it says King over there. Now if I can go here and change this from Rhodes to, say, MOND, and then save the data in the text file, and then go back here and do a refresh, I can see that we've updated the data. So now let's go and look at how the custom synchronization handlers were written. And I just want to emphasize that again. In this case we're writing to a text file on disk, but the example applies to a web service. So let's go back to design mode now, go back to our controls, and then go back to the list builder here, and then go to the detail view, and you can see now that because this list is based on a custom data source, these properties here have been exposed. So these properties here for the synchronization handler would not be shown if this list was based on a SQL data source, but in this case we've specified that we want to call an XBasic function called xbsync to commit data. Then after data has been committed, we want to call this function called xbrefresh, and then to perform an incremental refresh of the data, we want to call this function called xbrefreshincremental. So if we open up the smart field here and then show the function prototype, we can see the function prototype that gets generated that shows us what information will be passed in the E-object in this custom synchronization handler, and then what this function is expected to do and what properties it's expected to set inside this E-object. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video and walk through the synchronization process. So we're continuing our discussion on custom synchronization handlers, and I'm going to go now and save this, and then go back to my XBasic functions here and go to the xbsync function and just put a debug 1 in so we can step into the code as we synchronize the data. So I'm going to go there and hit the save button, go over to working preview now, and let's edit King and change that to Jones, and then go ahead then and hit the save button, and now hit synchronize, and you can see now we've called into our synchronization handler. So if we look here inside the E object, we can see that what got passed into us here in the E object is the data that needs to be synchronized, and inside the E.data.fields we have each field that was in the list, and we have for each value, let's go to say the last name field here, we have the new value and the old value. So this is, we typed in Jones, the original value was King, and we can see that the data in this field is dirty. But if we go, for example, to say the third field, which is Boston, this is dirty as false because there's no edit that was made in this field. So now that we have the data that was submitted and we know which fields are dirty and which fields are clean, we can write the XBasic that would perhaps make a web service call here to update the data, or in this particular case we need to write the data to a text file. So everything sort of from this point onwards is specific to writing the data to the text file and would be modified if you were writing to say a web service. So what we've done at this point now is we've basically taken this E.data.fields and we've converted it into JSON format. So there's our JSON format there. Then what we've done is we've gotten the primary key, so you can see that E.data.underbar primary key is the primary key of the row that we've just edited. And now we're going to call into our update row function, because E.update type here was set to update. Had we done a delete, this would have said delete, or an insert, it would have said insert. So now we're calling into our update row function. So let's debug into that. So here you can see we're going to read the existing data from the text file into memory. Then we're going to parse it. So now we've got basically an XBasic dot variable here, an array of objects. So there's the first row, there's the second row, etc. So now we've got a dot variable representing the data on disk. We're going to find which entry in the array is the one that the user is trying to edit. So we know that he's trying to edit the primary key value of 1. So we go look for the entry in the array that has an ID of 1. That gives us a value of ix1, which means we're trying to edit the first row. Now we're going to go there and parse the data. So there's the data that we have. We're going to parse that to get a XBasic dot variable called AF. So here's our dot variable that contains all of the values. And then we're going to just continue here, and we can step through this code here. We're just making our updates, and then we're going to write the data back to disk. So you can see now we've just executed some code here that says PI last name is equal to Jones. Then we're going to save the data back to disk and then save the file back onto disk. And at this point now, if we go look at our data here on disk, we can see that the edit that we made was saved to disk. So in the real world, writing data to a text file is obviously not realistic, but making a call into a web service that will synchronize the data is realistic. And using this sample here as a starting point, you'll be able to modify this code and use it to update lists that are based on web services. Thanks very much for watching.